The sea mist clung to the ferry's rails, a cold, damp shroud pressing against Dean's face. He stood on the deck, a solitary figure dwarfed by the enormity of the gray expanse, the churn of the water a monotonous rhythm beneath his worn boots. Grief had hollowed him out, leaving behind a profound emptiness that no amount of mapping the world's forgotten corners could fill. This island, this remote, fog-shrouded rock, was meant to be the antidote, the ultimate withdrawal. A place to simply exist, unburdened by the echoes of what was lost. He watched the coastline slowly materialize, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky. Even from this distance, the island exuded a desolate beauty, stark and unforgiving. Now only a will connected them, a final, unexpected tether. The ferry groaned as it nudged against the barnacled timbers of the small, rickety dock. A single, weathered figure, the ferryman, secured the lines, his movements slow and deliberate. He glanced at Dean, a brief, assessing look in his deep-set eyes, then turned away without a word. Dean hoisted his duffel bag, the weight familiar, comforting in its solidity. He stepped onto the shore, the shingle crunching underfoot, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the dense air. Beyond the dock, a rough track snaked upwards, disappearing into the swirling vapor. To his left, a hulking, skeletal structure loomed through the mist. A derelict factory, its shattered windows like vacant eyes staring out at the ocean. Rust streaked its corrugated iron walls, and a broken chimney pointed a skeletal finger at the sky. It added another layer of decay to the already bleak landscape, a monument to forgotten industry and perhaps forgotten lives. Dean hadn't heard him approach. Follow the track. Don't wander off. There was an unspoken warning in the man's tone, a subtle emphasis on the last two words that prickled Dean's senses. Dean nodded, turning to face the path. The fog thickened, reducing visibility to a few yards, turning the world into an indistinct gray canvas. He walked, the only sound the crunch of his boots and the distant, mournful cry of a gull, a sound that seemed to echo not just across the sea, but within the cavern of his own chest. Finally, the track widened slightly, revealing a low, squat building hunched against the elements. The lighthouse keeper's cottage. It wasn't picturesque. It was a fortress of gray stone, its slate roof patched haphazardly, its windows small and grimy, staring out at the invisible ocean. A single, rusted lantern hung beside the heavy oak door, swaying almost imperceptibly in the still air. The lighthouse itself stood further up the incline, a stark, white pillar swallowed by the mist. He pushed the key into the stiff lock, the tumblers grating in protest before yielding with a heavy thunk. The door swung inward, releasing a blast of stagnant air. It smelled of salt, mildew, and something else, something metallic and faintly organic, like dried seaweed or old blood, a scent that prickled the back of his throat. Dust motes swirled in the beam, a universe of forgotten particles. The furniture was sparse, a faded armchair, a small, round table, and a bookshelf crammed with thick, leather-bound tomes. Dean dropped his bag, the dull thud reverberating. He moved through the cottage, each step raising tiny clouds of dust. The kitchen was small, a cast-iron stove rusting in the corner. The bedroom held a narrow cot, its mattress stained. He returned to the living room, drawn to the bookshelf. His grandfather, a cartographer like him, though of a different era, had left behind a trove of forgotten knowledge. Dean ran a finger along the spines, maritime charts, old atlases, books on navigation, and surprisingly, several volumes on local folklore and sea legends. He pulled one out, a heavy, unmarked ledger. As he flipped through the brittle pages, a loose sheet of paper fluttered to the floor. It wasn't a page from the ledger, but a rough, hand-drawn map, meticulously detailed yet utterly unfamiliar. It depicted the island, but with strange, looping symbols scrawled along the coastline and a prominent, unsettling feature marked deep beneath the waves just off the island's westernmost point. And etched beside it, in his grandfather's shaky script, was a single cryptic word, awakening. A sudden faint scraping sound came from directly above him from the attic hatch he hadn't even noticed. It was a rhythmic, almost deliberate drag, like something heavy being pulled across rough wood. He froze, every nerve ending suddenly alert. The sound stopped. He held his breath, listening. Only the distant moan of the wind against the window panes. He told himself it was just the old house settling, the timbers groaning under the weight of years and the damp. The island swallowed Dean whole, not with a roar, but with a suffocating hush. The ferry churned away, its receding thrum leaving him stranded on a sliver of land where only the wind and the gulls seemed to hold conversations. The lighthouse keeper's cottage, a squat, gray sentinel against the slate sky, stood exactly as he remembered it from the old photographs, stoic, weather-beaten, and profoundly lonely. Inside, The air was thick with the scent of salt, damp stone, and something else, a faint metallic tang like old copper. He spent the first few days simply existing, unpacking sparse belongings, trying to impose order on the chaos of his grandfather's abandoned life. Dust motes danced in the sparse sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. Each floorboard creaked a different note under his weight, a discordant symphony that grated on his already frayed nerves. Dean, a man who found solace in the precise lines of a map, felt utterly unmoored. His cartographer's instinct, however, refused to be silenced. He began to walk the island's periphery, tracing its ragged edges on a mental grid, hoping the familiar ritual of observation would ground him. It was then he started noticing things. The tides, for one. They seemed wrong. He'd consulted the regional charts before coming, memorizing the predictable ebb and flow, but here, the ocean defied logic. One morning, the water surged far higher than it should have, lapping at the very base of the cottage stone foundation, leaving a dark, slick line that hadn't been there the day before. He saw it again and again. Erratic, almost breeding patterns, as if the sea itself had a fever. Dean found himself checking the tide tables on his phone with obsessive frequency, only to find them consistently at odds with the ocean's mercurial temperament. He reasoned it was the island's unique geography, perhaps an unusual current or an underwater formation he hadn't accounted for. The sea was a complex beast. After all, during one of his exploratory walks, following a particularly severe low tide that had exposed more of the shoreline than he thought possible, Dean stumbled upon the derelict factory. It stood hunched and broken-backed on a remote stretch of the coast, its skeletal metal framework picked clean by salt and wind. Rust-eaten corrugated iron sheets hung loose, rattling like skeletal teeth in the breeze. He remembered his grandfather mentioning it once, a fish processing plant that had closed decades ago. As he approached, the air grew heavy, smelling not just of brine and decay, but something else, something cloying and ancient, like wet earth and forgotten things. The tide had carved deep, unnatural channels into the rock around its foundations, exposing jagged, black stone that seemed to weep brackish water. He shook his head. Just the wind, rattling the old structure. The sound of the sea. At first, they were indistinct, easily dismissed as the wind whistling through the ill-fitting panes of glass or the sigh of the restless ocean. But as the days bled into each other, the sounds grew more insistent, more formed. It was like a chorus of distant voices, speaking in a language he couldn't quite grasp, weaving in and out of the roar of the surf. He'd snap his head up, scanning the empty room, his heart giving a small, unwelcome lurch. His mind, still raw from grief, was playing tricks. He hoped to find some old charts, perhaps some practical information about the island. Beneath a stack of mildewed navigation manuals tucked into a concealed compartment in the desk's deepest drawer, he found it. It was a journal, bound in thick, scarred leather, its cover warped and discolored by what looked like extensive water damage. The pages, brittle and swollen, resisted his touch, crackling like dry leaves. He opened it slowly, a faint, briny smell rising from the aged paper. The handwriting inside was his grandfather's, unmistakable in its looping, hurried strokes, but it was frantic, almost desperate. Interspersed with the dense, indecipherable text were crude, disturbing sketches, grotesque, bulbous forms, like deep-sea creatures with too many eyes and limbs tangled with distorted human figures. And then, the words, fragmented, repetitive. The pull higher, higher, closer they sleep, but they listen. The deep song it calls, don't listen, Dean. His grandfather had never been one for fanciful tales. He'd been a pragmatic, solitary man. This was something else entirely. He saw a drawing of the derelict factory, its foundations being eroded by impossibly high tides, and beneath it, a swirling vortex of ink from which emerged his single, enormous, unblinking eye. He slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small room. He tried to rationalize it, desperately. Grandfather had been alone on this island for decades, completely isolated after his wife's passing. The solitude, the relentless roar of the ocean, the endless fog, it must have warped his mind, led him to invent these morbid fantasies to cope with his profound loneliness. It had to be. The old journal lay open on the table, its pages brittle, its ink a faded testament to a mind slowly unraveling. Dean pushed it away, then pulled it back. A magnet he both feared and desperately needed. His grandfather's erratic scrawl, the frantic sketches of things that shouldn't exist, had planted a seed of disquiet that now took root, sending tendrils through his calm resolve. But the cold knot remained, tightening with each passing hour. He needed answers, real ones, not the fevered imaginings of a lonely old man. The cottage offered little in the way of conventional research materials. No internet, no phone line, but it did hold books, a surprising collection for a man who seemed to shun company. Dusty tomes on local history, maritime lore, even a few antiquated encyclopedias. Dean began to sift through them, his fingers tracing the spines, the dry scent of aging paper filling the small room. He found it in a slim, leather-bound volume titled Echoes of the Salt-Kissed Isle. It spoke of ancient beliefs, predating the lighthouse itself, whispered down through generations of islanders. Tales of a hidden city beneath the waves, not a ruin but a living, breathing place, home to beings of immense age and unknowable intent. They called it Yahan-Th-Lay, a name that felt like a burr on his tongue, both alien and strangely familiar. A pact, the text hinted, forged in primordial times. Dean felt a prickle of unease. His grandfather's journal had alluded to a pact, a bargain struck. Could it be this? The fragmented sentences about the calling and the bargain resonated with the ancient legends. It was fear, born of a perceived truth. He dismissed it as superstition, the morbid fascinations of a bygone era. That night, the dreams began. Above, the surface was a distant, shimmering membrane, an impossible escape. He saw no living things, yet he felt watched, perceived by unseen eyes. Then, shapes began to coalesce in the distance, vast and indistinct, moving with an impossible grace through the crushing depths. He woke with a gasp, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead, the phantom pressure of the deep still clinging to his chest. He swung his legs out of bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, and padded to the small bathroom. As he splashed cold water on his face, he noticed it. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from the grout between the tiles near the sink. A strange, almost beautiful phosphorescence, like tiny, submerged stars. He knelt, peering closer. It was algae, certainly, but unlike any he had ever seen, a vibrant, almost electric blue-green, pulsing with a soft, internal light. It wasn't just in the grout. A faint sheen coated the underside of the sink faucet, a delicate, almost imperceptible film. He touched it, and it felt slick, cool, and oddly resilient. The smell was subtle, a damp, mineral tang like the breath of an ancient tide pool. He scrubbed at it with a sponge, but it clung stubbornly, only fading slightly under the abrasive pressure. Where had it come from? The cottage had been thoroughly cleaned, or so he thought. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to scour every surface, to rip out the tiles, to escape whatever was growing silently in his home. The next day, the algae was brighter, more pronounced. It had spread to the windowsill in the kitchen, a thin, luminous tracing along the old wood, and there, scrawled in the margin, almost an afterthought, was a small, crude drawing of a factory building with an arrow pointing to a specific location on the island's eastern side. Below it, a single, unsettling word, threshold. He spent the afternoon poring over his grandfather's maps, cross-referencing them with the old local history book. The factory drawing a line with a decaying structure marked on a century-old survey map. A derelict factory, once a fish processing plant, long abandoned. The following morning, armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of foreboding, Dean set out. The path was overgrown, barely a deer trail, winding through dense thickets of gorse and wind-stunted pines. The fog, a constant companion on the island, had rolled in thick, muffling the sound of the waves, turning the world into a gray, indistinct canvas. Then, through a sudden thinning in the mist, a hulking silhouette emerged. It was vast, skeletal, its brickwork crumbling, its windows gaping like empty eyes. The derelict factory. As he drew closer, the scale of it became apparent. Rust-eaten machinery stood frozen in time, tangled pipes snaked across the exterior, and a tall, corroded smokestack pointed accusingly at the leaden sky. A strange, metallic tang mixed with something indefinably organic hung in the air. His grandfather's journal, the legends, the strange glowing algae, they all converged here, pointing to this forgotten, decaying place. He stepped inside. He traced a finger over a crude drawing of a ripple, an eye within a swirling vortex, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the sea air seeping through the cottage walls. A low, resonant hum began to permeate the room, a sound so subtle at first that Dean thought it was the wind vibrating a loose pane of glass. He paused, listening. It wasn't the wind. It was deeper, a note held long and low, seemingly emanating from the very foundations of the island. He felt it in his teeth, a faint vibration that set his nerves on edge. He frowned, dismissing it as fatigue, a phantom echo of the waves constantly crashing against the shore. He picked up a forgotten compass from the desktop, intending to put it away. There was no draft, no tremor in the floorboards, just a silent, impossible shift. He stared at the charts, then at his hand, then back at the charts, a prickle of unease spreading across his scalp. His breath hitched. He needed to believe that. Later, rinsing his face at the basin, Dean caught his reflection in the streaked glass of the mirror. For a fleeting, horrifying instant, the face staring back wasn't quite his own. A faint, greenish luminescence flickered around the edges of the distorted image, an unholy halo. He blinked, hard, splashing water on his face. When he looked again, his own tired, familiar features stared back, wet and pale. He scrubbed at his eyes, his heart now a frantic drum against his ribs. The hum intensified, a persistent thrum that felt like it was originating from inside his own skull. The journal, now a terrifying roadmap, lay open to a page filled with frantic cross-hatchings and an urgent, barely legible note. The old factory. The offering must be renewed. Keep it still. Keep it fed. Dean's gaze snagged on the word fed. What could his grandfather have been feeding? And why at the derelict factory? He remembered a loose floorboard in the small, rarely used pantry off the kitchen. A place his grandfather had always kept locked. He knelt, fingers prying at the warped wood. Beneath it, nestled in the damp earth, was a small, crudely carved wooden box. A shiver ran down his spine. These were keepsakes. They were tools, offerings. The compulsion to visit the derelict factory was immediate, overwhelming. The journal's cryptic instructions, the unsettling discovery in the pantry, and the incessant, maddening hum all pointed to that forgotten structure. The wind howled like a banshee as he stepped out, thick fog rolling in from the sea, reducing a world to shades of gray. He walked, the hum now a palpable pressure against his eardrums, feeling like a beacon drawing him forward. The derelict factory stood a mile inland, a skeletal ruin of rusted girders and broken windows, a testament to a long-dead industry. Every gust of wind through the shattered panes sounded like a mournful sigh. Dean stepped over crumbled debris, his boots crunching on broken glass and loose gravel. The hum was deafening here, a vibrating current that made his teeth ache and his skin crawl. He pushed open a heavy, rusted door that groaned in protest, revealing a cavernous interior. The floor was slick with moisture, a thin film of brackish water that reflected the dim light from the outside. A pool of black, stagnant water lay within it, utterly still. The hum vibrated through his bones, a low, guttural growl that felt like it was tearing at the fabric of reality. He leaned over the edge of the basin, peering into the inky depths. He saw nothing but his own terrified reflection, shimmering on the surface. Then, the reflection rippled, not from a disturbance in the water, but from within it. It grew, expanded, pushing up towards him. He saw no distinct features, only a vast aqueous bulk, a suggestion of countless, hungry eyes swirling within its depths. Dean gasped, stumbling back, his heart leaping into his throat. He scrambled backward, his mind screaming, slipping on the wet floor, his hand scraping against rough concrete. The entity in the water pulsed, its formless mass growing larger, pushing against the confines of the basin, threatening to spill over. He didn't wait. He burst out of the factory, gasping for air, the fog a welcome, blinding shroud. His grandfather hadn't been mad. He had been trying to keep something at bay, and now that something was awake, and it had tasted the air. He traced a crude drawing, a swirling vortex of lines that seemed to pull at his vision, then focused on the accompanying text. The language was archaic, fragmented, riddled with personal anxieties that mirrored his own burgeoning unease. The pact his grandfather had written must be renewed. Its hunger grows, its whispers claw at the thin veil. Dean frowned, a chill prickling his scalp. This wasn't just observation, it was participation. His grandfather hadn't merely recorded the island's secret, he had been an active participant in its containment. Another entry, dated years later, spoke of the deep song, a phrase Dean was beginning to hear, or imagine he heard, in the relentless churn of the waves. It seeks entry, the faded words warned, through the cracks in the mind. The ritual holds it, but the price is sanity. Dean felt a familiar pressure behind his eyes, a dull throb that had become a constant companion since arriving. He squeezed them shut, trying to dispel the image of the journal's frantic symbols burning into his retinas. He reread a particularly dense passage, deciphering phrases like the offering, the barrier, and the forgotten place. The forgotten place. The derelict factory. He remembered seeing its skeletal silhouette against the horizon during one of his walks, a hulking monument to forgotten industry. His grandfather had clearly been there, and not just for idle exploration. It wasn't merely external. It pulsed within his skull, a deep, pervasive vibration that blurred the edges of his thoughts. The air in the room grew heavy, tasting of salt and something ancient, metallic. Was the floorboards truly shifting beneath his feet, or was it just the song playing tricks on his perception? He rubbed his temples, the hum growing louder, pressing in, making him question the solidity of the walls, the reality of the flickering lamplight. He stood, the journal clutched in his hand, a sudden urgency propelling him. The derelict factory held answers, perhaps even tools or components for this ritual his grandfather had mentioned. He had to go! The fog outside was a living shroud, thick and impenetrable, clinging to the ground like a hungry spirit. It swallowed the beam of his lantern, reducing visibility to a few struggling feet. The path twisted and turned, eventually leading him away from the coast, through gnarled, wind-battered trees that clawed at the sky. Was it the mist playing tricks, or was something truly out there, drawn by the song, watching him? Finally, the monstrous shape of the derelict factory loomed out of the swirling gray. Its broken windows stared like vacant eyes, its corrugated iron skin rusted and peeling. Dean pushed through a gap in a collapsed wall, the sound of his boots echoing eerily in the vast, empty space. Twisted machinery lay scattered like the bones of some colossal beast. The deep psalm was deafening here, a roaring current that threatened to sweep his thoughts away. He could almost taste the sound, a bitter, saline tang on his tongue. He fought to keep his mind clear, focusing on the journal's cryptic directions. He found it in a collapsed office, half buried under a pile of rusted filing cabinets, a heavy, lead-lined box. His grandfather's precise hand had etched a symbol onto its lid, a complex spiral that seemed to draw the light into itself. The diagram, combined with the journal's earlier warnings, clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The deep song wasn't just a phenomenon. It was a call, and the ritual was a countermeasure, a way to keep the entity dormant. And the forgotten place wasn't just a metaphor. The X on the diagram indicated a hidden chamber, a crypt, directly beneath the lighthouse. His grandfather hadn't just observed, he had maintained a prison. And now, the prison was weakening. The deep song thrummed violently in his ears now, a relentless, deafening pressure. He ran his hands along the rough-hewn stone walls, following the lines of the diagram in his mind. Then, his fingers brushed against a faint seam, almost imperceptible, hidden behind a loose stone. He pushed. The deep song swelled from its depths, a promise of unimaginable horrors, a summons he could no longer ignore. The wind, a relentless sculptor of the island's bleak contours, tore at Dean's jacket as he trudged towards the derelict factory. Its skeletal frame, a grim monument of rust and broken glass, dominated the northern promontory, a place he'd instinctively avoided before. Now, it drew him in, a moth to a flickering, malevolent flame. He remembered the precise angle of its collapse, the way the setting sun would catch its jagged edges and make it look like a monstrous, sleeping beast. He'd dismissed it as an eyesore then, an industrial scar. But his grandfather's cryptic notes, the unsettling tremor in the earth, the way the ocean had begun to taste of something ancient and foul, it all pointed here. The path, overgrown with thorny gorse and tenacious sea grass, crumbled under his boots. Rubble twisted girders, and shattered panes of glass lay strewn across the cracked concrete. A lone, petrified seagull, caught mid-flight in some long-forgotten gust, lay preserved in a dusty corner, a macabre sentinel. Dean walked through the main entrance, a cavernous maw where the double doors had long since rotted away. Inside, the sheer scale of the abandonment pressed in on him. The silence was profound, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through broken panes and the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs. He tasted grit on his tongue, the air thick with the memory of industry and the slow, inexorable march of entropy. He moved deeper, his senses on high alert, every shadow seeming to writhe, every creak of settling metal echoing in the vast space. He wasn't looking for anything specific, yet a strange intuition pulled him toward the factory's heart. He ran his hand along a rusted lever, the cold metal gritty under his fingers. It felt like touching a fossil. Then he saw it, not a direct path, but a subtle anomaly in the uniformity of the decay. A section of the concrete floor, near what must have been the deepest part of the factory, looked less disturbed, almost meticulously cleared. He knelt, brushing away decades of dust. They pulsed, or rather, seemed to vibrate with a faint, internal luminescence that only his heightened perception could catch. He pressed against the spot, and with a groan of stressed concrete and rusted gears, a section of the floor slid inward, revealing a gaping blackness. The passage was narrow, carved not just through rock, but through some unyielding, obsidian-like substance. The air grew heavier, the pressure building in his ears. The tunnel opened into a vast, circular chamber, its ceiling lost in the inky blackness above. And in its center, dominating the space, was it. It wasn't an artifact in the conventional sense, nor a simple portal. It was both, and something far more terrifying. A colossal, pulsating sphere, not of metal or stone, but of a substance that defied categorization. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic beat that resonated with the thrumming in the ground, a heartbeat that was ancient, alien, and impossibly vast. As Dean stared, mesmerized and horrified, the air in the chamber grew thick, distorting the light from his flashlight. Then, the vision began. It wasn't a hallucination, not a trick of the mind. It was a direct infusion, a torrent of images and sensations flooding his consciousness. He saw the island, not as he knew it, but as a fractured, dying husk. He saw the land itself contorting, stretching, becoming thin and translucent, revealing something vast and multi-limbed. Something immense and utterly without form, stirring beneath the waves. It wanted the island not to destroy it, but to absorb it, to twist its reality into something else, something that served its own unfathomable purpose. And Dean saw himself not as a cartographer, not as a man, but as a vessel, a conduit. He was being drawn in, his mind unraveling, his very essence dissolving into the vast, crushing pressure of the deep. The vision receded, leaving him gasping, his lungs burning, his mind screaming in silent protest. The thrumming intensified, a guttural growl from the depths. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a horrifying revelation. The entity wasn't just stirring, it was here, it was awake, and it had already begun to claim its prize. The islet was merely its antechamber, and Dean, a fly caught in its cosmic web. Now, it drew him in, a moth to a flickering, poisonous lamp. The massive, corroded doors, long, unhinged, sag open like a gaping maw, exhaling a breath of decay and metallic dust. He hesitated at the threshold, the air inside a tangible heavy thing, pressing against his skin. He stepped over a threshold of crumbling concrete, the crunch of loose gravel under his boots echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. The derelict factory stretched out before him, a cathedral of abandonment. Light filtered through grimy, shattered skylights high above, cast long, distorted shadows that writhed with his every movement. The air smelled of salt, rot, and something else, a faint, briny sweetness that made his stomach clench. It was the same scent that had clung to the lighthouse, to the island's peculiar tides. Here, it was concentrated, thick enough to taste. He moved deeper, his footsteps swallowed by the vastness. Rusting machinery, hulking and silent, stood like petrified beasts, their gears locked in eternal slumber. A fine layer of reddish dust coated everything, shimmering faintly in the weak light. But it wasn't just the silence that unnerved him. A low hum vibrated beneath his feet, a frequency just at the edge of hearing, a deep thrumming that resonated in his bones. It felt like the island itself was a drum, and something vast was beating within its core. Not auditory, not quite. Join us. Embrace the deep. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently, trying to dislodge the intrusive thoughts. This was it. The entity wasn't just observing anymore. It was actively trying to breach his defenses to claim him. A sudden, crushing weight pressed down on his chest, making it difficult to draw breath. It wasn't physical. It was a psychological assault, a profound sense of despair and insignificance threatening to engulf him. His fingers found purchase on the rough, peeling paint, the texture momentarily grounding him. He pulled it out, his hands trembling, fumbling with the worn leather cover. He flipped through the brittle, salt-stained pages, his gaze darting across the cramped, spidery script. The hum intensified, vibrating through the journal itself, making the paper feel alive. He gasped, a strangled sound, tears blurring his vision. He wouldn't let it break him, not now. He forced himself to focus, scanning for anything that wasn't a desperate plea or a rambling observation. He found a section heavily underlined near the back. The writing was more frantic here, hurried, almost illegible in places. The door, once opened by a willing hand, requires another to be shut. A life for a life. A true offering. Dean's breath hitched. A terrible sacrifice. It wasn't metaphorical. It meant an actual life. He read on, his eyes devouring the words, desperate for a loophole. A different interpretation. The vetting of the deep cannot be undone with two realities. It demands blood, freely given, at the locus of its awakening. The derelict factory. This place. His grandfather hadn't just observed the entity. He had understood what it required, and he had written it down, a grim instruction manual for an impossible task. He felt the entity surge, a wave of pure malevolence washing over him, attempting to drown his thoughts, to seize control. His head swam. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing. The hum became a roar, vibrating through his teeth. He gripped the journal tighter, knuckles white. A life. Whose life? His own. He was trapped, terrified, but a grim determination began to harden within him. He was the last line of defense. The factory groaned around him, the metal framework seeming to twist under an unseen pressure. The entity was here, now more present than ever, aware of his discovery, sensing his struggle. It was trying to break through, to possess him, to stop him from even contemplating this sacrifice. Dean looked down at the journal, at the symbols, the incomplete ritual. He didn't understand the specifics yet, but the core requirement was terrifyingly clear. He was facing an impossible choice, a horrifying bargain. He had found a way, but the price was everything. The words in his grandfather's journal still seemed to hum, vibrating against the vast, decaying silence of the derelict factory. Dean stared at the scrawled script, a cold dread seeping into his bones, colder than the damp air clinging to the metal skeletons around him. This place, outside, the island was screaming. The wind, which had been a persistent moan, now howled like a tortured beast, tearing at the factory's corroded walls. Metal groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the concrete floor beneath Dean's boots. He could feel it in his teeth, a low thrumming that was both sound and sensation, a psychic pressure that pressed in on his skull. He moved to a broken window, the glass long gone, and peered out. The world beyond was a maelstrom. Fog, previously a soft, ethereal blanket, now swirled with unnatural speed, churning like agitated milk. Dean squinted, trying to make sense of the chaos. The sea, usually a distant roar, now crashed against the cliffs with an impossible fury, its spray reaching higher than he had ever witnessed, tasting like iron on the wind. And then he saw them, or thought he did, within the churning mist. Grotesque shapes seemed to form and dissolve. Not clear, defined figures, but suggestions. Limbs too long, forms too bulbous, eyes that were only momentary gleams of unnatural light. They were fleeting, like phantoms woven from the fog itself, but the impression they left was profoundly unsettling. The island was transforming, becoming an extension of the thing that stirred beneath it. Patches of rust on the machinery seemed to blossom, spreading like a fungal growth, taking on strange, almost organic patterns. Dean pulled back from the window, his breath catching in his throat. He gripped the journal, knuckles white. He found a relatively dry, sheltered corner amidst the industrial debris near a stack of rusted barrels, and sank to the floor. The journal fell open to the pages his grandfather had marked, filled with frantic, almost desperate scribbles. The reveal/discovery hit him like a physical blow. The counter-ritual wasn't about banishing the entity. It was about rebinding it. It had never been truly gone, only dormant, held in check by a pact made centuries ago, a pact that required a living anchor. His grandfather, the last keeper, had been that anchor, his life, his sanity, his very presence on the island, a constant sacrifice. To re-establish the bond, to force the entity back into its slumber, required a new anchor, a new keeper. It demanded a profound, irreversible merging of consciousness with the island itself, with the pact, with the very thing Dean sought to contain. It meant sacrificing his identity, his connection to the world beyond the island, perhaps even his humanity, to become a living, breathing part of the ancient prison. It was a commitment to an eternal vigil, a slow conscious dissolution into the essence of the island's defense. A wave of nausea washed over him, bile rising in his throat. This was the immense personal cost. Not death, but something far more insidious. A living death, a perpetual twilight existence. Dean thought of the map he had been trying to draw, the precise lines and contours of a world he understood. This ritual would shatter that understanding, replacing it with something ancient and terrifying, something that saw the world not in lines and borders, but in currents and pressures, in deep, unfathomable time. Join us! Become one! Roeus! He pushed back, clenching his jaw. He saw the face of the colleague who had helped him, the quiet concern of the general store proprietor. He thought of his own life before the tragedy, the simple pleasures he had once known. All of it, he would lose. What if he didn't? The island would be consumed, and then the world beyond. The choice, stark and terrible, was his. His determination, forged in grief and now tempered by horror, hardened. He would not let it happen. Each item felt impossibly heavy, charged with a latent, unsettling energy. Dean could feel the entity's impatience, its growing power. The very ground seemed to vibrate with its anticipation. He stood in the center of the vast space, the journal clutched in one hand, the strange implements of the ritual in the other. He knew the price, and with a grim, resolute breath, Dean prepared to pay it. The grandfather had known. He had tried to stop it, to contain it, but something had gone wrong. Now, Dean held the key, the final, terrible piece of the ritual. He didn't hesitate. Not truly. The instinct to flee was a distant, whimpering thing against the rising tide of grim determination. He clutched the journal, its worn leather cover a strangely comforting weight, and stumbled out of the echoing factory. The wind, a biting, relentless force, immediately tore at his clothes, whipping strands of hair across his eyes. The sky had turned a bruised, ugly purple, and the sea, a churning obsidian, clawed at the island's jagged edges. The lighthouse, a solitary sentinel on the furthest promontory, seemed to pierce the turbulent gloom like a bone. The journey was a brutal assault on his senses. Rain lashed down, mingling with salt spray, blurring the already treacherous path. Each step was a battle against the wind, which shrieked like a banshee, carrying with it not just the smell of brine and storm, but something else, a deep, cloying scent like forgotten ocean depths and decaying kelp, overlaid with a faint, metallic tang. It was the entity's rat. He realized tasting the air. It was drawing closer, its presence thickening, pressing down on the island like an invisible, suffocating hand. He saw things in the driving rain at the periphery of his vision. He fought them back, focusing on the lighthouse, a beacon of desperate hope against the encroaching madness. Finally, he reached the base of the tower. The air here was electric, thrumming with an unbearable pressure that made his teeth ache. The stone of the lighthouse itself felt alive, vibrating beneath his touch. The light, usually a steady, rhythmic pulse, now flickered wildly, casting errant, frantic beams into the storm, as if struggling against an unseen force. He pushed open the heavy iron door. The entity was here. It wasn't a physical creature in the way he understood them. It was a tear in reality, a gaping maw of non-existence that bled into the world. Sounds warped, the groan of metal, the shriek of the wind, the distant crash of waves, all twisted into a discordant symphony that vibrated directly within his skull. He climbed, each step a monumental effort. Visions flickered before his eyes. The quiet, still face of his lost loved one, their last smile, then their final, empty gaze. The entity was trying to break him, to drown him in his own grief, to make him believe his struggle was futile. You are alone. You are always alone. He reached the lantern room. The glass panes were fractured, spider-webbed with cracks, and through them, Dean saw the impossible. The center of the room, directly beneath the lamp, pulsed with a sickly, iridescent light. The grandfather's journal fell open to the final page, as if guided by an unseen hand. The diagram was complex, ancient, depicting a series of symbols and an intricate pattern that needed to be etched, chanted, and finally, sealed with a profound personal sacrifice. Dean's hands trembled, but his resolve held. He found the tools his grandfather had left. A silver stylus, a small, intricate compass, and a bowl of phosphorescent powder. He began to work, tracing the symbols onto the cold stone floor, his movements precise despite the chaotic energy swirling around him. The entity shrieked, a sound that tore at the fabric of his mind, rattling his teeth in his skull. The lighthouse groaned, metal fixtures tearing loose, glass shattering, showering him with shards. He saw himself, small and insignificant, utterly meaningless in the face of this ancient, indifferent horror. He was nothing. His life, his grief, his purpose, all dust. The entity wanted him to understand, act, to accept his insignificance, to give up. But he remembered the journal, the desperate hope in his grandfather's final entries. He remembered the love he had lost, and the reason he was fighting. He finished the etching, the phosphorescent powder glowing with an eerie light. Now, the sacrifice. The journal spoke of severing the link, of surrendering that which bound one to the world, to seal the portal forever. He understood. His grandfather had bound himself to the island, to the watch, to contain it. Dean had to do something more. With a ragged breath, Dean closed his eyes, his mind replaying the face of his lost loved one. He held the image, then, with a terrible, wrenching effort, he pushed it away. He let go. He sacrificed the solace of memory, the pain that kept them alive within him, the very emotional core that had driven him to this desolate place. He became a watcher, not a mourner. He became a vessel for the sealing. A blinding flash erupted from the etched symbols. The pressure in the room intensified, then snapped, like a taut wire breaking. The impossible colors faded, the sounds normalized, and the flickering light of the lantern room steadied. Dean slumped against the cold stone, gasping, sweat mingling with tears and rain on his face. The portal was gone. The entity was pushed back, sealed away. But something inside him was gone too. He had saved the island, but he had lost a part of himself, a part he could never reclaim. The island was safe, but Dean, the man who had come seeking solace, was no more. The words in his grandfather's journal still seemed to hum, vibrating against the vast, decaying silence of the derelict factory. Not a place where it would awaken, but a place where it was awakened, held in a delicate, terrible balance. And the balance was failing. A litigation, a sacrifice, a guardian. The island wasn't just a home. It was a prison, a tomb, a ward against something unspeakable. His grandfather hadn't merely kept a lighthouse. He had kept a secret, kept it at bay. And now, the mantle, heavy and suffocating, had fallen to Dean. There was no escape. There had never been. He pushed off the rusting support beam he'd been leaning against, the screech of metal echoing like a cry. It was the deep song, not merely a sound, but a presence, a hunger. He could feel it pressing against the crumbling walls of his mind, a vast, patient weight. Following the crude map etched into the journal's final page, Dean navigated the treacherous floor, avoiding pits and precarious stacks of corroded machinery. The air here was stiller, heavier, charged with an almost palpable hum. The space below was a circular chamber, its walls of rough-hewn stone, distinct from the factory's industrial shell. In the center, a pool of black, stagnant water reflected the meager light filtering down from above, a mirror to an unfathomable depth. And around the pool, etched into the stone, were symbols. Dean recognized some from the lighthouse. Others were alien, squirming patterns that seemed to shift at the periphery of his vision. This was it, the locus, the heart of the pack. He had to offer something. Not a life, not exactly, but a tether, a connection, a piece of himself to bind the deep song, to remind it of the pact. The water was utterly still. yet he felt currents beneath its surface, unseen things stirring, waiting. He found the small, tarnished silver locket his grandfather had worn, tucked into a hidden recess in a stone. Inside, a faded photograph of a young woman, Dean's grandmother, smiling, and beneath it, a tiny, almost invisible cavity. As the locket snapped shut, a low, resonant thrum began to emanate from the pool. It wasn't a sound Dean heard with his ears, but felt in his bones, a vibration that resonated with the very marrow. The surface of the black water rippled, not from wind, but from an internal tremor. The symbols on the stone walls glowed with a faint, phosphorescent light, pulsing in rhythm with the thrum. He felt a vast, ancient intelligence brush against his consciousness, a flicker of something so immense, so utterly other that his sanity wavered on the brink. The deep song, it was acknowledging him, accepting the offering. Accepting him, the thrum intensified. Then, with a final, shuddering pulse began to recede. The phosphorescence on the walls faded, the ripples on the water stilled, returning to its mirror-like blackness. The immediate that the encroaching madness had receded. But at what cost? Dean pushed himself to his feet, his limbs heavy, his mind a fractured landscape. He felt different. The world seemed sharper, yet simultaneously distant. He could still feel the echoes of the deep song in his thoughts, a faint, constant hum beneath the surface of his awareness, and knowledge he now carried, a burden that would never lift. He was bound to the island, to the derelict factory, to the black pool. He was the guardian now. His grandfather's sacrifice wasn't an end, but a continuation. He walked out of the sub-level, back into the main factory, the cold air no longer chilling him, but feeling like a part of him. The island's fog, once merely an atmospheric condition, now felt like a living shroud, a protective veil that hid the secret he was now sworn to keep. He knew the deep song was still there, always there, waiting.